Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. I mean, I wish the team, actually I'm the series producer. The episode producers were Leo Cheng, Grace Lee, and Geeta Gandaber, and they would be really moved by, because this is exactly what we wanted. We wanted the series to raise discussion and also reflection of where we've been, where we're going. And to echo Bryan, actually in the very first staff meeting, we remembered our ancestors, both the storytellers, the filmmakers who came before us, and also our ancestors, not only family, but the people in the unsung Asian American heroes who have really fought the good fight over, this past, actually centuries that we've been here. Of course, when we started this series, this was before the pandemic season we're in now, this pandemic of disease and hate. But the central kinds of fault lines were already there, and they've been there throughout our history here in the US. But particularly in recent years, the US has become much more diverse, but at the same time more divided. So we wanted to answer the question, or at least propose the question, how do we move forward together as Americans? And we really believe that the Asian American story helps to illuminate that way forward. I mean, today people have talked about actually two sides of the American dream. And one is, we come here for a better life, for economic opportunity. But the other side of the American dream is this pursuit of equality. And, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. And Asian Americans have always been on that trajectory. But that part of the Asian American story really is not known. And story really matters, particularly when we're talking about, moving forward in solidarity. The African American novelist, Toni Morrison, said, there's a master narrative that's been written, but we haven't written it. It's been written by somebody else. And so what we want to do with the series is help to rewrite our own narrative and our own story as Asian Americans. Part of the narrative that's been imposed on us has been the narrative of the model minority and the perpetual foreigner. We saw that, with early immigration in the 1800s, where we started the series. We see it today. Another part of that narrative that's been imposed upon us is conflict with other people of color. There is tension and conflict, there always has been, but there has always been solidarity, and that story is not known. So, we started the series, not at the very beginning of when the first Asian Americans came here, but we started with the first major wave of immigration, which is, around mid 1800s and after the Civil War, a time when the US was rebuilding and looking for labor. And even then, the narrative of a racial hierarchy and racial difference that operates today was being constructed. In 1878, a politician said, one white man is worth two Chinamen, but one Chinaman is worth two Negroes. So you can see even the seeds of not only this idea that we're different, we're the other, we're the perpetual foreigner, but you can also see the seeds of the model minority and the wedge and the way the model minority has been used as a wedge against other people of color. So there's no coincidence. We thought that anti-Asian exclusion and Jim Crow laws were happening at the same time in that early period. But there was also solidarity. I mean, a few years after that politician stated, the white men, Chinamen, Negro, his racist motto, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was enacted, but Frederick Douglass, the Black abolitionist leader, denounce the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. He denounced it as being a racist measure. In the early 1900s, South Asian immigrants and other Asian immigrants were supporters of the Marcus Garvey movement. And in fact, the editor of Marcus Garvey's newspaper, Negro World, was an Indian immigrant. So from the very beginning, Asian Americans have been on that trajectory of fighting for justice and equality. And not only for Asian Americans, but for all Americans. You know, in the early period, you can go back to Wong Kim Ark, who was a US born, he was citizen, Chinese American. In the late 1800s, he was a restaurant worker in San Francisco. And he was denied re-entry to his home of the United States because he was Chinese. And he didn't take it sitting down. Wong Kim Ark took his case all the way to the US Supreme Court. And, you know, if you're like me, if I had to go to traffic court, I'm like jittery. But can you imagine at a time when Chinese Americans were near the bottom of the social rung, were completely politically powerless in this country, and he had the balls to take his case to the US Supreme Court, and he won. He won. He won the precedent for citizenship birthright, so that anybody born here, regardless of who their parents are, if their parents are immigrants, if they're undocumented immigrants, they can be they're US citizens. That's how my parents became US citizens, because my grandparents, who immigrated from Japan in the early 1900s, were considered for over 50 years, about 50 years that they were here, they were considered aliens ineligible for citizenship. But their children were born in Los Angeles and Salt Lake City and different places in the US, and they were all US citizens. So you know, all of us, and we were a mostly Asian American team, we all did look to our family stories when we were creating the series. You know, as I mentioned, my grandparents came in the early 1900s. My mother's father came in April of 1906. And as soon as he stepped off shore in San Francisco, he was chased down by merchant marines who, you know, threw rocks at him and told him to go back to China. He was from Japan, but they told him to go back to China. So he just took the first bus or wagon train or whatever down to Los Angeles. I mean, as it turns out, the next day was the San Francisco earthquake in 1906. So he missed the earthquake. So maybe they saved his life. But, you know, from his first step onto American shores, he was harassed because of his race. He was assaulted because of his race. But his children, of course, were born as US citizens. However, they were born as second-class citizens, as Nisei, as Japanese Americans. The family lived through the Great Depression. In World War II, they were either imprisoned in concentration camps, or in the case of my father and my uncles, they were in the US Army. But in the 1950s, they were able to rebuild, and in large part because of the civil rights movement and the Black movement for equality. I mean, my family, and I realized this, it kind of dawned on me much later in life, that one of my first homes outside of Chicago, in a suburb of Chicago, there were only 3 Asian American families in the entire town. And we all lived on the same block. And until I was an adult, it didn't dawn on me that we lived on the same block because of redlining. But we were actually able to desegregate the town because there had been restrictive covenants where people of color, Asians, African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans were just not allowed in many cities and towns and neighborhoods around the United States. Asian Americans at one time in many states could not intermarry with a white person because of anti-miscegenation laws. We went to desegregated schools. We couldn't get the jobs we wanted. but those doors were open to us by the civil rights movement. But at the same time in the 1950s is a time when this idea of the model minority who, you know, just pulls themselves up by their bootstraps and works hard and, you know, is very quiet and turns the other cheek, that began to be used as a wedge against the Black civil rights movement. But for my generation, the third generation, and I came of age during the 1970s in the birth of the Asian American movement, we learned for the first time about the civil rights movement. We learned for the first time about our parents and our grandparents' history and their sacrifice. And we were able to stand up and we were able to create new points of solidarity with other people of color, with other Americans who wanted equality, no matter their background or race. So today, you know, we're writing the first draft of this history, and this is a historic moment. And this pandemic of hate is, and the idea of the Chinese virus, the Kung flu, that's not a new story. But the solidarity that we're seeing across Asian American communities and the solidarity with other communities of color is also not a new story. It's not a new story. And that's something that with the series we wanted to amplify. And I'm so grateful to be a part of this conversation because that's exactly what your community, your organization is really doing, and with people of all generations, Asian Americans of all different nationalities. So just to close, you know, Asian Americans today are fighting back and standing up. It's full circle from the years of Frederick Douglass and the years of the early Asian American immigrants. And that's an old story that I really like. But thank you so much. Thank you so much for organizing this and inviting me.